As a horror fan, it'll come as no surprise that the thing that stood out to me the most about Martin McDonagh's terrific comedic tragedy, The Banshees of Inisherin, is how the second half begins to feel remarkably like a ghost story, or at least a superstitious Irish folktale. Now, I'm not going to claim this to be the most out there interpretation, seeing as this isn't something the movie is trying to hide. After all, the title is literally in reference to an ancient Irish myth, which I covered previously in the Irish creature feature The Hallow. However, we'll come back to the Banshee later. Anyone familiar with McDonagh's work will know he is no stranger to injecting superstitious and religious connotations into the subtext of his stories. Hell, Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, which is probably his most mainstream work, is arguably his most grounded story to date, whereas his plays like Hangman and The Pillowman and films like Seven Psychopaths and most significantly In Bruges all have their elements of absurdity and farce mixed with deeply macabre undertones about the brittle nature of life and death. All of them are funny, but also deeply depressing, and The Banshees of Inisherin sees McDonagh truly amplify the personal nuances that make his particular writings so unique. Banshees tells a very simple story. Two longtime friends, Padraig and Colm, have a falling out, and that's it. That's pretty much the story. We see Colm one day confront Padraig, telling him to leave him alone and never speak to him again, leaving Padraig baffled as to why Colm no longer wants to drink or chat with him.
You do like me?
I don't.
Admittedly, I've been in this situation myself, so the story touched me in a way I'm not afraid to admit was all too real at times, but the tensions in their complicated relationship tie into how the island itself is established. The immediate image that came to mind while soaking in the cold, barren, desolate, and frequently eerie island of Inisherin was a purgatory, not far off the tone established by his brother John Michael McDonagh in his hugely overlooked tragedy Calvary, which deals with a priest confronting his own mortality in a similar Irish setting involving similar Irish people. You'll be most familiar with McDonagh's recurring use of purgatory if you've ever seen In Bruges, a film I would love to review but could never do justice to in the way that Evan Pushtek did on his video dealing with In Bruges' approach to morality and purgatory, starring the same two lead actors. Inisherin is a land completely disconnected both figuratively and literally from the problems of the real world, specifically the Irish Civil War perpetually reminding us of its chaotic presence in the distant mainland. As everyone and their mother has highlighted by this point, you can see how the conflict between Colm and Padraig can be interpreted as a small-scale allegory for the Civil War, as speaking from my own experiences being taught Irish history in school, ultimately, even to this day, makes very little fucking sense.
It's the most interesting he's ever been. I think I like him again now.
We're not going to get into the politics of it because it is excruciatingly complex and there's too much to consider, but in a very simplistic sense from the outside looking in, the handling of Irish division has pretty much been based on either non-stop stubbornness or compromise, which to be fair is fashionable in the world of politics in general. There's actually a joke made by the pub landlord about how Colm and Padraig should just shake hands and make up so they can get back together and unify under one commonality: hating the English. The lack of a clear, straightforward reason for the conflict is mirrored in the fact that Colm doesn't give Padraig a proper justification for why he no longer chooses to be friends with him. He does throw out vague and petty excuses, from feeling a need to re-examine his purpose in life to simply claiming Padraig is just a bit dull.
2 hours you spent talking to me about the things you found in your little donkey shite that day. 2 hours, Padraig.
I mean, nobody is obligated to be your friend. People drift apart naturally all the time. It's just that morally we're conditioned to think that being nice to each other is the correct way to be, and to see Padraig's niceness get no validation from Colm, only scorn and resentment, shatters the illusion that being nice actually means anything. There's a prevailing sentiment of depression on the island. Padraig thinks that's the reason for Colm Colum's jarring mood shift, but ultimately it's a sentiment that applies to all of them, and is one they all actively share in. Since they're in purgatory, there is a void none of them are able to fill. Patrick's sister Siobhan has never been able to find true love or companionship, Patrick's timid friend Dominic is abused and oppressed by his domineering father, Patrick himself begins to question the sincerity of others, and Colum, honestly, I can't say for sure if there's an easy answer for what he's going through. Ultimately, there is no definitive reading on any of the characters. It really comes back to the simple notion that humans are complicated and you just gotta learn to live with it. As inherently desperate as we are for answers, like with most of the topics I discuss on this channel, life isn't always that cathartic. It's consolidated in Colum's petty debate about the significance of pub small talk. He wants meaningful conversations about art, and Patrick just wants a good laugh. Both are reasonable expectations, but anytime Patrick attempts to show compromise and engage with Colum's wants, Colum is still a stubborn dick about it. It all culminates in a haunting tonal shift in the second half of the story, where after Colum gives Patrick an ultimatum that if Patrick doesn't leave him alone, Colum will cut off each of his own fingers, Colum shows that he wasn't bluffing. At this point, I'm going to start getting into the superstitions surrounding the Banshee, so of course spoilers for those who want to watch the film for themselves. Firstly, for the purposes of this metaphor, to answer the question as to why I think Colum chops off his own fingers, it's pretty much the Irish version of to cut off your nose to spite your face. Colum is established as a brilliant violinist devoted to making meaningful music, and so his fingers are naturally his most precious resource. Thus, it's a very extreme way of him willingly and stubbornly sacrificing the most important part of him just to tell someone to fuck off. It really is just sadistically petty. Anyway, there's a recurring character throughout the story called Mrs. McCormick, who can basically be summarized as the island's resident crazy cat lady, but without the cat. She grows increasingly menacing each time she's reintroduced, initially serving as just a creepy old lonely lady looking for attention, and later wandering about believing that death is upon the island. She effectively becomes the film's unquestionable banshee, as going back to my Hallow review, the Irish Post describes it as a harbinger of death and doom. If you see the banshee about, the chances are something bad will happen to those that you love. In the case of Inisherin, the characters always try to hide from Mrs. McCormick when they can, mainly because she creeps them out, but it subtly echoes that very need to avoid the deathly presence she brings. When you take her presence in conjunction with Colum's finger-cutting escapades, there's an abnormality that gradually plagues Patrick's descent into his own petty retribution, eventually alienating both Dominic and Siobhan, the former losing loyalty at Patrick's newfound meanness, and the latter leaving the island because a war sounds a hell of a lot more tolerable than the shit these two dickheads are getting up to. Niche comparison, but given McDonagh's roots in theatre, Mrs. McCormick actually reminded me of the narrator in the musical Blood Brothers. They are completely detached from the story. They don't influence it, they don't interject or get involved. Hell, you could even remove them and they wouldn't change anything. But they are always there, always watching the chaos unfold while serving as a haunting, deathly motif. Eventually, we see everyone trying to separate themselves from Colum and Patrick's conflict because they don't want to get dragged into something that's clearly escalating to potentially dangerous consequences. Yet, ultimately, the hard-hitting reality of it all, the fear that manifests into the story, to the point I genuinely grew uncomfortable like the other characters, is that all of this still spirals out of two men just not getting on with each other. It shows a domino effect of what petty and bitter behavior does to us. The story feels pointless, for the record, there is no real resolution, because, well, the point is to show how a small grievance can manifest into devastating consequences if unresolved. The Banshee is always there, basically warning them of what happens if they do not reconcile or compromise. However, the solution is pretty much given to Patrick by Colum from the very beginning. Just walk away. Colum's constant finger chopping is a result of Patrick trying to fix an unfixable situation when the instigator has made up their mind and won't compromise. It really is a "it's not you, it's me" type situation, just let go. Patrick's unwillingness to back down despite Colum's warning eventually leads to the film's most heartbreaking scene. There are two of them, but this one hits the hardest. After Colum chops off his remaining fingers and throws them at Patrick's front door, Patrick's absolutely adorable pet pony Jenny, which becomes a character in its own right throughout the story, chokes to death while attempting to eat them, leaving a shattered Patrick to warn Colum he's going to burn down his house, but of course not without saving Colum's dog first because he's not a savage for Christ's sake. What makes this scene a profound point to the story is that it's an inconsequential result of an inconsequential conflict. The pony had no bearing in this fight. It innocuously lived its peaceful life and got pulled into a pathetic fight and ends up being the hapless victim of a feud where both Colum and Patrick are responsible for the outcome. Colum for stubbornly cutting off his own fingers, and Patrick for stubbornly just not leaving him alone. The other victim of the story is Dominic, whose body is discovered drowned in a lake, but it leaves it ambiguous as to whether it was accidental or self-inflicted. I'm more inclined to lean on the latter because this was the very same place he was rejected from love, and it goes in hand with the film's portrayal of hurting oneself as a response to an emotional pain they cannot tangibly heal. It ends with Patrick burning down Colum's house only to find him alive by the beach the very next day. The now petty Patrick confronts Colum, spiteful that he survived, but after giving back Colum's dog as a sign that Patrick can't fully sacrifice all the niceness within him, unlike the sacrifices that Colum made to his fingers, Patrick finally chooses to walk away, having received validation for his niceness in the form of a simple thank you from Colum, accepting their irreconcilable differences.